Hello everyone and welcome to Gorogoa. Just before I start speaking I want to apologise for the fuzz in the audio. My microphone's pretty bad and I'll look at a few better options for the future. Also I just want to say that this is a pretty short game, and while I'm not really going to spoil anything, I will say that anything to do with this game visually is technically a spoiler. If you want to go in as blind as possible, I highly recommend minimising the screen and listening to what I have to say. So, Gorogoa is a puzzle game that has been in development since 2011 by Jason Roberts. The game has garnered some attention at a few shows like Indicade, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, and Independent Games Festival, mostly for its visual style, which just straight off the bat I will say is a very strong point in the game's favour. So, the game is made entirely from these hand-drawn animations and environments. Virtually every one is pretty visually stunning. In fact, the only thing I would really criticise in this area is perhaps the main character, who just looks a little plain by comparison to some of the really elaborate environments and kind of super detailed parts of the game that I guess I'll explain a bit later. So, while I'm speaking about the aesthetic of the game, I'll say that overall it's a really colourful game that does two things very, very right in my opinion. First of all, it's very colourful, but it is also really tasteful in its use of colour. So consistently throughout the game you'll find these like washed out environments and lots of white, which not only kind of help certain parts of the environment pop out at you, you know, way more so than they would if it was just all this insane colour mess, but also it's incorporated with the actual mechanics in a pretty interesting way, which I'll get to later. Secondly, where some colourful games kind of fall short for me, this game really succeeds. Oftentimes you'll find in games with just huge colour palettes, they have kind of an inconsistent tone, or certainly can do anyway. It can kind of destroy your immersion slightly and just sort of drag you out of the atmosphere that the game is attempting to create, which is really important to Gorogoa actually. And by comparison, it uses a huge range of colours without ever feeling inconsistent. It never really betrays its general aesthetic. Everything still looks very hand-drawn and kind of toned down and just subtle, which is a really nice look to the game. And it also helps it keep its atmosphere really strong. Everything just kind of looks like it really belongs in this world. So I suppose this takes me onto the music, which is composed by Joel Korolitz. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, it's a kind of strange second name. And this is the same guy who composed the audio for The Unfinished Swan, which is another game that was heavily praised for its aesthetic. And in Gorogoa he has composed a very atmospheric ambient album that moves very calmly and is very toned down, much like the game itself. While it may not be the greatest piece of ambient I've heard all year, it is one of the better soundtracks I've heard this year. So at this point you're probably saying, that all sounds lovely, but how does the game actually play? I've kind of saved talking about this because I think it has a pretty unique mechanic at the like core of it. And it stands out as a puzzle game for sure. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of puzzle games, just to give you some context. I feel like a lot of them just kind of tread over the same ground and the same mechanics a lot, but I feel like this actually separates itself quite a bit. Essentially what the game does is it splits your screen into 4 quadrants, which is then kind of occupied with a small interactable window. And if you've been watching the video, you probably have a good idea of how it plays. So basically, you have these 4 quadrants, like I said, and each of them will kind of, or not each of them actually, any individual point, only a certain number will be filled. Like sometimes you'll have one window that has this frame in it essentially, or you might have like up to 3, I think at some points in the game you actually do have the full 4 and the screen is just packed and you kind of have to work out where to go. And each of these windows is individually explorable. So for example, you could zoom in on very specific items in the window, you can kind of zoom out, or maybe like just go from left to right, that kind of thing. And it's kind of like exploring a painting in a lot of ways, which I'm sure lots of people will say, because the hand-drawn kind of aesthetic really sort of reinforces this, this artful perspective. So essentially, you can kind of explore these individual pieces, and they just might be a piece of nature or some buildings that, you know, maybe you can zoom into a window and then go in there and there's a person looking in a book or thinking about something, and then there might be a light somewhere. And essentially, what your goal is in each of these is to figure out how to kind of move your character forward. You have to go and do something, right? So, for example, you might have to figure out how to move him from one, like, there's one really interesting part of the game that I enjoyed quite a lot actually, where essentially, in one of the quadrants you have your character in a painting that's, or sorry, in a photograph that's in that frame itself, and you have maybe, I don't know, 6 of these pictures and an arrow going from each one to the next. So you kind of have to, the game just implies you have to kind of get your character from one painting to the other, and eventually there's like a final painting that you have to get into, or sorry, photograph. And the way you do that is by connecting one of the other quadrants to perhaps create this kind of like 2-quadrant, large, wider frame, and your character might be able to move from one to the other, like essentially moving through the quadrants, which normally you can't really do, but they all connect in interesting ways, and there's some where maybe you even connect like 3 of them and it does something really strange. Like there's a couple that actually turn gears, which is a really interesting thing. Like you'll have, say for example, a person just walking and like ringing a bell perhaps, and if you connect that with another part of the frame, it will kind of create this desert, and he walks, you know, and just the whole thing moves. And maybe at the top of that you have something that looks like the bottom half of a gear, and then in another frame you can zoom into a gear, and perhaps it looks at the top half, and you put that frame above the one I just mentioned, and maybe the man is now moving the desert along, and it's also moving this gear and turning the whole thing as both halves have now formed. So you've got really interesting moments like that are in the game that are just super creative and kind of like, they're a really different way to think about puzzle solving. It's not very, it's more abstract than it is mechanical, I guess is how I would describe it. And a lot of the puzzle solving in the game itself is kind of like that, and that's reflected in the story as well, which I'll speak about a bit later. But just to continue speaking about the gameplay, I feel like this concept of having kind of a bunch of abstract images, specifically 4 on the screen, and kind of moving them about to get them to interact with other pieces to kind of push the story forwards or see where you need to go to next. It's a really interesting thing, and I haven't really seen it been done much, and I really hope that it goes to influence kind of more puzzle games in the future, because as much as I really do like this game quite a lot, I think it's actually pretty outstanding, honestly. I don't feel like it fully explores this mechanic, which is maybe one of my complaints, I guess. I do feel like there were more things that it could do, but at the same time I don't want to, you know, like shit on it too hard, because basically I feel like the game is a very, very tight package, and none of it is really wasted, whether that's visually, mechanically, from an audio perspective. Like, it's a very tight package that has a very particular purpose, and like I said, each of the puzzles is kind of more abstract than mechanical, but as a result that kind of means that once you've solved a puzzle there's no replayability, really. The only replayability there might be is after completing the game I have, you know, 6 of 10 achievements on Steam, and there's 4 hidden achievements, so, you know, there's clearly something hidden in the puzzle to find, which is pretty interesting, and, you know, I may go through and play it again, we'll kind of see. So just to get on to the story, I guess, the game essentially starts with this kid who's on screen, and he's flicking through this book, and he sees this, out of a window, he sees this really strange, colourful dragon-type thing just moving through the city, and he opens his book, and like I said, he kind of flicks through the pages and looks at one page that has this dragon on it, but then underneath the dragon he sees this picture, or small part of the picture, that's essentially 2 people holding up a bowl, and this bowl appears to have 5 just abstract, differently coloured things in it, which sort of as you go through the game you realise are different fruits. As a result of this, the game's story is effectively your character going through various places and trying to find these 5 fruits. And I won't spoil any of the story, because honestly it's kind of difficult to spoil in a sense, because it is told in such an abstract manner, but there's lots of really interesting themes about spirituality, religion, there's some symbolism in there as well if you're really kind of paying attention, lots of recurring visual themes which tie into the symbolism, like there's lots of nature, you focus a lot on the sky and the stars, there's decay and there's growth throughout the game that you'll see, which is pretty interesting. I will say that it's not perhaps the most emotionally punchy because it is quite abstract, and as a result I can completely understand if someone was to not enjoy that aspect of the game, because it is very abstract and more interpretable as opposed to giving you this kind of very, very specific story. And just finally, I just want to praise the game on one thing that I think really should kind of be praised, and that is that in a lot of puzzle games you'll kind of sometimes come to the point where you're used to the mechanics, you're kind of you know what's going on essentially. But the problem is that sometimes you'll hit a wall and all of a sudden you won't be able to solve this puzzle for whatever reason. You might have all the things in front of you and it's just really hard, which I would personally consider a lot of the time to be good puzzle design. And sometimes you might just be missing a piece of the puzzle essentially, and that's what I would a lot of times consider to be kind of bad puzzle design. I will say the Gorogoa definitely fits into the first category, where everything is presented to you, and there are lots of really fantastic visual clues in all of these really detailed kind of environments, so you're never at a loss as what to do, and the game will definitely try and give you clues to point you in the right direction, but you still have to kind of work it out yourself. You still have to go through the thought process yourself, it's a really interesting thing, and it's very well designed in that sense, which is part of the reason that I'm glad that the game decided to stay very tight, and instead of, trying to stretch out the game length to some insane amount, it kept it pretty short and pretty compact. So just while I'm talking about the game's length, actually I'll say that, like I said, it is short. I finished it in about 114 minutes, which is just shy of 2 hours. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be kind of the average length that people are finishing it in. Someone cited 2 to 3 hours, but honestly I do think it would take most people about 2 hours. I'm certainly not great at puzzle games, and that's how long it took me. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I just got through really quickly for whatever reason. But one thing you can do to kind of extend the game if you want, and also I honestly kind of wish I played with this option on. So if you go to the options menu, you'll find an option to turn off a certain feature the game has, which is essentially if you click on any of the frames not on one of the interactable things, all of the interactable things make themselves, obvious. Like there'll be a little kind of expanding circle that comes away from them, so you just know, oh, I can click on that thing and it will zoom in or it will do a thing or whatever. And there's an option to turn that off, so it kind of takes you a bit longer to find what's in each frame. And personally, I'd recommend playing with this option off again if you want to expand the lifespan of the game, or if you just, kind of want it to be a little bit tougher. I suppose it wasn't the hardest game in the world. There were a couple points where I was a bit like, not sure what to do here, and again, the game gave me lots and lots of really good clues as to what to do visually, which was, again, a massive point in the game's favour. But I suppose I should just conclude now. I think the game is very strong. I think it's a super enjoyable puzzle game. It's got a very unique, interesting, gorgeous aesthetic. The music's good, the gameplay is really good, the mechanics kind of expand on themselves. Like I said, maybe not as much as I hoped they did, but they certainly don't get boring. One thing it does that's really interesting, I won't spoil exactly at the end, but as you go on the quest to kind of find each of the 5 fruits, each fruit kind of introduces not a new mechanic as such, but just a new spin on the puzzle solving, and then at the very end it does this really interesting kind of like flashback through each of the things it introduced. And it is a really interesting way to handle the ending of the game. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I think I'm going to rate the games I review on this channel. I'm not 100% sure yet, but if I were to rate this one, I would definitely give it somewhere between like a 7.5 to an 8 out of 10. So if you find yourself wanting to pick up Gorogoa, again, I'd highly recommend it. The game is available on Steam and GOG for PC. According to the website, it's also available on Apple's App Store and finally on the Nintendo Switch. I'm personally not too sure about the prices anywhere other than Steam, but on Steam you can pick it up for £9.11 until the 21st of December, but then after then it will be £11.39, so it's essentially you're getting a discount for release week. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it's informed you on this game, and I hope you go on and pick it up and kind of spread the word, because it is really worthy of your attention. Cheers for checking out the video, and cheers for sticking with me until the end. It's kind of ended up being a bit of a lengthier review than I kind of intended. I guess I had more to say about it than I initially thought, but yeah. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment or subscribe. Let me know what you thought of the game, let me know what you thought of this review, how I can improve it beyond the just production quality, because I understand it's not the best, certainly, to begin with. But yeah, cheers guys!